Welcome live streamers then. All right, very good. Well, and if my voice happens to get a little too low, you'll just remind me to keep it up. So, nice to see everybody. Thank you for the accommodation on the time this morning. We're going to meet for only an hour, and then at 11 o'clock, I assume right here in this room, there will be another of our town hall meetings, we're calling them, conversations about the Fairmont conversation. And most of you know that those discussions with Fairmont are ongoing. We've been engaged heavily in them for the last 6-7 months. A merger is not yet inevitable, but we are certainly moving quickly toward it and have arrived at no impediments whatsoever in a complex situation. So 11 o'clock, and there will be 2 more. This is the third of 5. If you're interested in these discussions with Fairmont and have a view, this is not just an information meeting, but it is also a genuine discussion. I came to the first, was unable to come to the second. Fairmont is having them, and people raise their concerns, as well as their approval and gratitude for moving these discussions forward. So if you are concerned about one element or another and feel like having it be part of the ongoing conversation, by all means raise it because finally there will be a congregational vote on this. And we therefore want people to be as informed as possible and also to feel that their concerns are heard, if not positively responded to, right? So that will be that, right here at 11 o'clock, 11 to 12. A couple of things. First of all, thanks to Maud Shaffron for bagels, live stream, and pickup. Thank you so much. We're so pleased. A trifecta is a rare thing. And so we appreciate it. And Maud, we express our condolences to you on the death of your sister. Okay, so there will be no Torah study for the next 2 Saturdays. Next Saturday is consecration of our first graders into religious school. Hold on just a sec. And the consecration service is a lovely service. We have all of the first graders there. There are 41 of them this year, the largest first grade class we've had in a long time, which is extremely promising and exhilarating. And it's a lovely service down at MPAC at University Circle, Silver Sanctuary. 10 o'clock, if you're interested or curious, come down. It's really an enjoyable experience. The following week, what's that? The 14th, I think, I will be away for a family wedding. So our next session will be on the 21st. We miss from time to time, but we try to do it on a continuing basis. Okay, blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Michael, you had a comment or a question.
Yes, I have a question for you. This meeting with Fairmont, which is a great thing, but is it possible that in Temple-Tifereth they will print at least all concern or summary of each meeting that the people who could not attend live or streaming?
It's a good suggestion. So Michael is asking whether or not it's possible to include in Temple Times, the monthly newsletter, the results of the different discussions. I don't know that that will happen. I will definitely pass the suggestion on, But your general point, specifics aside, is a good one, that we need to communicate what is going on as well as we possibly can. You well can understand, I hope, that the discussions needed to be confined to the committee, not only our committee, but the conversations with the Fairmont Committee, until we really get a sense of how we're proceeding, what the issues are, and so on. To bring it out for the public conversation too soon would have yielded only a lot of I don't know, we don't know, we're not there yet, and so on. So as soon as, and one of the benchmarks was to bring it to the board so that the board could affirm that we're on a good track and we can keep going. The board may have said, we really don't feel that this is good enough, that we're in a good enough place to go ahead, please let's halt. And we always had a alternative plan, alternative option if these discussions didn't yield the fruit that they have, and that was to suspend them and to look for a senior rabbi. We're not looking for a senior rabbi because we feel that the chances for the merger to happen are great. If they should run aground in January, February, March, we will probably hire an interim rabbi for the following year and decide what to do after that. So the timing of congregational involvement had to be delayed, but now that it's open, whatever communications we can provide, we'll be sure that people know what is going on and allow them to think about it and to offer their own suggestions. Okay, so we are working on the issue of creation. And as we pointed out last week, the creation story itself, even though it is an expression of an overwhelming mastery of God over the world God created, order, purpose, hierarchy, and so on. But one can overstate the issue of mastery precisely because there are conditions in the world, according to Genesis 1, whether or not they are primordial, whether or not they existed before God began to create, or they're part of God's creation. It just depends on how you translate the first couple of words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That suggests before that what precedes beginning? Nothing, except God. In the beginning, then the problematic elements may have been created by God. If you translate the first words, when God began to create, at time t on the temporal continuum, God created, then those elements could be primordial. And what are they? They're darkness, both literally and metaphorically. They are waters, and they are chaos of one kind or another. So that at the end of the creation story, those elements may have been put aside, but they've not been destroyed. And a good illustration of the capacity of elements to burst their bonds. After all, what did God do? God created the sky and put waters above and waters below. And therefore those waters are there. And they come back to haunt the Noah story. Now, they come back to flood the earth and therefore to overwhelm all the order that God created, destructive waters. The deep was opened, and those waters were always there. And the flood story shows their destructive capacity, not only in the Noah story, but in the future. So the Noah story, the flood story, creates the anxiety, expresses the anxiety that for all of God's mastery, anti-order elements always exist. And this is a way of, subsequently, as we'll see, to understand some of the great problems that confront our world. Natural elements, historical elements. After all, the Noah story shows that one of the elements of chaos is human nature. Because God decided to send the flood, because evil, sinfulness became so pervasive that God was sorry he had made the world at all. After the flood, God recreates the world. In other words, the order is creation, destruction, recreation, and says to human beings, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, just as God said in Genesis chapter 1, and forms a covenant with Noah and says he will never again destroy the earth with waters. So we have, let's call it thesis and antithesis. Creation, destruction. And this sets the table, according to this line of thinking, for everything that comes, everything that ensues. Elements of chaos, of destruction, of dismay, and God's ongoing capacity to recreate the world, even though the world has its own autonomy. Human nature, floodwaters, as a kind of synecdoche apart for the whole, other elements of nature that are destructive, and the chaos that we see in our world. So what I'd like to do, you notice, by the way, that those first two great epic stories, creation and Noah, are the two poles of biblical religion already right there. And what's fascinating about it is God is not seen as omnipotent. Those waters burst the scenes. Now, in that story, God calls the waters. So perhaps God's autonomy is asserted there, but we're going to see that that is being held in question. So the book that I've been using to describe these things is the book I mentioned last week by John Levinson, who teaches at Harvard, was at the University of Chicago before that. And the title, evocative title, is Creation and the Persistence of Evil. Persistence. Subtitle, The Jewish Drama of Divine Omnipotence. Divine omnipotence, and I'm going to read a passage that asserts this, is not to be seen as a static reality. God is omnipotent, period, but a dynamic reality. And the dynamic reality, the story of God's coming into omnipotence and receding, is what Levinson calls drama. The subtitle, The Jewish Drama of Divine Omnipotence. Okay? So let me read a couple of things from this book just to give you a sense of the dynamics of this particular situation. The operative, it's right in the middle of a paragraph here. If you're buying the book, you have the book, you're interested, I'm just going to tell you what pages I'm on. Roman numeral 16. It's a preface. The operative dichotomy is not that between limitation and omnipotence, the limited God, the omnipotent God. We might say God is limited. In other words, both of those ideas have been championed. Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People features a limited God who weeps when his children suffer, but can't do anything about it. So God's benevolence is secure, but God's power is compromised in a limited God. It's one way of explaining evil in the world. God wishes God could handle it, but God can't because God is limited. So that deals with the reality of pain and suffering in our lives. So Livingston is saying it's neither limitation, a limited God, nor a fully omnipotent God, but that which lies between omnipotence as a static attribute. That's Aristotle's view. God has all the perfections, has and always will have. That God is omnipotent, that's one of God's attributes, and it is never not the case. So, the operative dichotomy is not that between limitation and omnipotence, all power, but that which lies between omnipotence as a static attribute, you see what he means by static, never changing, and omnipotence as a dramatic enactment. The coming into being at certain moments of God's full power. The absolute power of God realizing itself in achievement and relationship. What this biblical theology of dramatic omnipotence shares with the theology of a limited God is a frank recognition of God's setbacks. In contrast to classical theodicies, a theodicy is an attempt to justify the ways of God to human beings. The task of Milton in Paradise Lost. In contrast to the classical theologies with their exaggerated emphasis on divine impassibility. God doesn't change. That's the classical idea of divine omnipotence. So let me go back. What this biblical theology of dramatic omnipotence shares with the theology of a limited God is a frank recognition of God's setbacks. In contrast to the classical theodicies with their exaggerated commitment to divine impassibility and their tendency to ascribe imperfection solely to human will or the recalcitrance of matter or the like. Okay? So classically, the problems of our lives are being attributed to elements outside of God. Matter. Why do we die? Why do we get sick? Because the very possibility of individuality is matter. What separates us is our material existence. And by definition, matter decays. And that's the reason. And God had a choice. Should I create individuals or shouldn't I? And if God said, if I create individuals, they're going to die, I've lost control of that process because matter has its own logic. Maybe I don't want people to die. Well, there goes the possibility of individuality. That's the idea of blaming things on elements outside of God. Human free will. Okay? The classic, so he goes on to say something else. But whereas the theology of the limited God provides exoneration of a sort for God's failures, God is limited. Therefore, he's to be excused for the bad things that happen to us. I'm reading it again. Whereas the theology of the limited God provides exoneration of a sort for God's failures, the theology of omnipotence as a dramatic enactment allows people to fault God for the persistence of evil and to goad him, G-O-A-D, into reactivating his primal omnipotence. So, who's to blame for the problems? God to some significant degree. But God always can rise to the occasion. How do I know that? Because God rose to the occasion in the creation of the world. The creation of the world lays the foundations for attributing great power, omnipotence to God, expressing itself sometimes, but sometimes not. And to goad him into who does the goading? We do. And we saw an example last week of the psalmist saying to God, wake up. Now, why would a piece of literature make it into Scripture if it's fully blasphemous? Wake up, God, is not blasphemous in the worldview of the drama of divine omnipotence. So, and to goad him into reactivating his primal omnipotence, which is never relinquished, but often agonizingly, catastrophically dormant. One might call this latter position a theology of omnipotence potentially. Omnipotence recollected from the cosmogonic past. Cosmogonic has the word Genesis in it. Gonic, Genesis. A cosmology, with the end of with its logos, the idea, the thought of a cosmos, cosmology. What is the cosmology? How does the universe look and work? As opposed to cosmogony, a discussion of how the universe was created, Genesis. So one might call this latter position a theology of omnipotence potentially. Omnipotence recollected from the cosmogonic past, namely Genesis chapter 1. God's already done it. If somebody asked me to draw a five-sided square, the first question I would ask is, has anybody ever done it before? And if the answer is yes, then I'm going to take a stab at it. If the answer is no, and it has to be no, why would I try? If God can be called to express God's power in a very dire situation, the first question to ask is, has God ever done this sort of thing? And the answer is yes, in Genesis 1. And then in the recreation of the world after the flood. So we can count on the creation story as a precedent for the rationality of calling God to bring order again. But the waters of the flood in Noah's time shows that that order is always perilous and can break out again. One might call this latter position a theology of omnipotence, potentially. Omnipotence recollected from the cosmogonic past and expected in the eschatological future. A good future, a future of hopefulness. What's the precedent for hope? God already did it. The waters of chaos and human nature caused the unraveling of the created order. Just as the Babylonian exile did for the Israelites. Right? God had always said, I'm here, I'm with you, I'm protecting you. So how'd the Babylonian exile happen? How did the Roman exile happen? Because God can't fully impose God's will. But there's hope because God recreated the world after the flood of Noah. I'm going to read this sentence again. One might call this latter position a theology of omnipotence, potentially. Omnipotence recollected from the cosmogonic past and expected in the eschatological future. Past, present, future all work together organically, but it's always focused on the present, today's issues. And a recollection of the past and rational hope make us to understand the present both in terms of its reality, don't try to argue it away, and that it's not the last word. Hope is the last word. Recollected from the cosmogonic past and expected in the eschatological future, but only affirmed in faith in the disordered present. So, don't you think this is a magnificent view? And we might ask ourselves the question we're always asking. Does this interpretation work? And the question, does this interpretation work, is preceded by a different question. How might this interpretation be energized by current reality? In other words, how do new interpretations arise on the scene? Somebody has an insight into the text. Okay, that's part one. But part two, something's in the air in contemporary society. What's in the air? The Holocaust. So this is an attempt. I don't know that this is true. I don't know that Levinson thought about it, but I find it an intriguing idea that the issues of the day, in whatever day you happen to live, create the possibility of new interpretations. This is an interpretation needed in our time, right? To sustain hope without minimizing the catastrophes of the 20th and the 21st century. Hard to maintain. How can I believe in God anymore? Well, this idea gives, I think, a very fascinating way of seeing it. Okay? So, contemporary social realities may lay the groundwork for new interpretations, but whether those those responses to the current reality work depends upon the ingenuity of the interpreter. And ingenuity is both a personal attribute and a rhetorical one. Is the interpreter clever? Does the interpreter see things? But the rhetorical one is the interpreter's interpretation persuasive to others? And if the answer to that is yes, we have a new block in the edifice of the Jewish tradition of understanding the Bible. So, contemporary reality creates the possibility of seeing things anew, and where would we like to see them? If we found those interpretations in Martin Heidegger and Soloveitchik or in Immanuel Kant, we would say, great, that has nothing to do with us as people trying to make our way in the world from a Jewish perspective. But if you can find those interpretations in the classical text of Judaism, then you've made a contribution. So there are really two questions here. One is, how appropriate to the needs of our day is this interpretation? And does it work as an interpretation? So that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit. I'm going to read a little more, and we're going to go to some texts. So here is on Roman numeral 17. The overwhelming tendency of biblical writers as they confront undeserved evil is not to explain it away, but to call upon God to blast it away. Explanation doesn't deal with the deep emotional need of a community that wants to remain faithful. And so there's an assumption here that the community wants to be faithful and is calling upon God to deal with the crisis and the creators of the crisis. I like that very, very much. I'm on Roman numeral 22. I'm in the middle of a sentence. It would still not follow that God's control was conceived as constant and invariable. It was not, is what Levinson says. Instead, one would then still have to ask what the historical analog is to the natural phenomenon of summer barrenness and so on. In other words, the cycles of nature, that the earth is not yielding. What in Israel's experience gives them the perception that God is as inactive as a dying and rising God between God's death and resurrection. Is God dead? What gives Israel, the ancients, a warrant for thinking that this God is not dead but only inactive? This may be the Achilles heel of this interpretation. That God, when the people went into Babylonia, God didn't prevent it or call an end to it right away or 2 weeks later or 2 years or 20 years later. It lasted for 70 years. Why was God inactive? And Levinson confesses throughout this book that he has no answer to this question. He is just taking it as a reality that helps to understand the persistence of hope over and against the persistence of evil. Then he suggests that we look at Psalm 44. So if you have your Bibles, let's look at Psalm 44. Notice we're not looking at Aristotle now. We're looking at the Bible itself, which deals with this problem. In fact, presupposes the problem. Psalm 44.
Page 1157.
1157? 1157. Thanks, Madam. We have heard, O God, our fathers have told us, the deeds you performed in their time, in the days of old, past. With your hand you planted them. You displaced nations. You brought misfortunes on peoples and drove them out. It was not by their sword that they took the land. Their arm did not give them victory, but your right hand, your arm, your goodwill, for you favored them. In other words, you were effective in the past. You did this for your people. You are my king, O God. Decree victories for Jacob. The use of the imperative mode. Sivat, savet. Do it. Through you we gore our foes. By your name we trample adversaries. I do not trust in my bow. It is not my sword that gives me victory. You give us victory. Or I might say, you gave us victory, and we can count on your persistent giving us victory. You thwart those who hate us. Verse 10, yet you have rejected and disgraced us. You do not go with our armies. You make us retreat. Okay? Past, God did what God can do on our behalf. Present, it's not working now. Where are you? You made us retreat before our foe. Our enemies plunder us at will. You let them devour us like sheep. You disperse us among the nations. You sell your people for no fortune. You set high price on them. Is this a component of faith? They are blasting God. The rebuke is excessive and ongoing, isn't it? What role does this have in the economy of a biblical theology? Verse 13 again. You sell your people for no fortune. You don't get anything from it. If anybody sells something, one wants to get something for it. You're doing this gratuitously. There's nothing in it for you. You just sell your people for no fortune. You set no high price on them. You make us the butt of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. I'm always aware of my disgrace. I'm wholly covered with shame at the sound of taunting revilers. What might the reviling be? Oh, this is the God you believe in? This is the God in whom you trust? The God who doesn't seem to be coming to your rescue? So your God may, for all we know, be malevolent. Or worse, no action, no existence. Maybe the God in which you believe, in whom you believe, doesn't exist. This is what Jonah felt, right, when he was asked to go to Nineveh and to proclaim punishment is coming. He didn't want to go because he knew God was a forgiving God and it wouldn't happen. But if the punishment didn't happen, it didn't happen for one of two reasons. The one who was going to make it happen decided not to, or there is no one. What's the cause of nothing? Nothing. And that was Jonah's concern. And that's the concern of those who revile. Maybe there is no God at all. All this, verse 18, has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you. You're forgetting us. We're suffering. We're remaining faithful. Or been false to your covenant. Our hearts have not gone astray, nor have our feet swerved from your path. Though you cast us crushed to where the sea monster is, sea monster, which is an element in the chaos story of creation, where God isn't just saying, let there be, and creation happens from God's calm utterance, but by conquest of great monsters. The so-called Chaos Kampf, the great battle against chaos. And here there's an invocation of that idea. Though you cast us crushed to where the sea monster is, and covered us over with deepest darkness, the return of the elements of chaos from the creation story, which have never been vanquished. If we forgot the name of our God and spread forth our hands to a foreign God, God would surely search it out, for he knows the secrets of the heart. It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, that we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Okay, so, you used to do good things for us and our ancestors. We don't see it today. We're suffering, not only in fact, but as the object of derision and scorn of our neighbors, yet we've remained faithful to you. So God, verse 24, wake up, rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awaken, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Ignoring our affliction and distress, we lie prostrate in the dust. Our body clings to the ground. Arise and help us. Redeem us as befits your faithfulness. What a poem. There's a narrative here, isn't there? And its culmination is an assault on God. We know you're capable of doing this. You did it in the past. Why aren't you doing it now? Wake up. The drama of divine omnipotence, where from time to time God seems either indifferent or lacking the power. But here's where the faith comes in. We know you have it because you've done it. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do you have any research as to who and when this was written?
We do. This psalm, we don't know. There's only one psalm that we can date with some certainty, and that's Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon we laid down our lyres. So that could not have been written before the Babylonian exile. Otherwise, we just don't know when they were written or over and in what circumstances. And in a way, there's something grand about that, because this psalm cannot be located in one particular time and place. Rather, it is applicable to all times and places. That's why we read it today. That's why we should read it today, because it expresses the resolute resistance to easy answers. There is an answer if only God would set his alarm clock. Get up and come to our aid. Yes, please, Amy.
Is there any part of this that talks about how powerful choosing to do nothing is?
How powerful?
Choosing to do nothing is. If God isn't doing it, it's maybe not because he can't, maybe it's because he thinks it's in our best interest for some reason we can't see that he's not doing anything.
Okay, well, it's an interesting point. So there is a very famous idea out of, I think I mentioned Leibniz last week, Gottfried Leibniz, who was one of the great rationalist thinkers of the European history. We link Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz together as rationalists who believe in reason as the vehicle for understanding and resolving the human condition, as opposed to empiricists who believe it's data, it's experience, and not reason. And Leibniz has this principle known as the principle of sufficient reason. And the principle of sufficient reason is there is a reason for everything. And therefore, why do we suffer? I think I pointed this out last week. Why is it that a righteous person gets hit by a falling piano from the 12th floor? That doesn't make any sense. And Leibniz's position, and maybe it's a response to your point in general, is that, here's what Leibniz says. A change in a local situation, that piano, may have drastic consequences for the general situation. I shouldn't be hit by a piano if I live a righteous life. But let's suppose some force diverted that piano falling. And so the laws of nature are now selectively applied. If I were evil, the piano would fall. If I were righteous, the car barreling down on me crossing the road all of a sudden stops. What kind of world would that be? What kind of general situation would that be if that were the case, that if you were righteous, you didn't suffer? Well, I mean, it would make righteousness a matter of calculation and not a virtue. I better be good, I better be honest, because it's good for me. And there goes morality. It's all calculation. So your point, Amy, is maybe the absence of the application of an idea in a particular situation, this one, would cause greater harm in the general situation if we could count on God, for example, always to come to our aid. So I think it's an interesting general question. And you notice, Voltaire and Candide mocks Leibniz's view that this is the best of all possible worlds. Because Leibniz's theory of sufficient reason means there's a good reason for everything, and therefore any change in the way things are would make the world worse and not better, even though it's hard to imagine why or how that would happen. Okay, so let me go now back to Levinson for a minute. Time has a way of moving on, doesn't it? Roman numeral 23. What provokes the troubling exhortation, this is of Psalm 44, is the awareness that history, no less than nature. So notice what Levinson has added here. The whole creation story with the Noah is all about nature, the elements of chaos found in nature. Now he's adding the elements of chaos found in history. So God here could be called upon to rectify problems in both nature and history. And why history? Because history is motivated, animated by human action. And God has already pointed out in the Noah story that human action leads the world to chaos and has to be reordered. So what provokes that troubling exhortation is the awareness that history, no less than nature, slips out of God's control and into the hands of obscure but potent forces of malignancy that oppose everything God is reputed to uphold. I'm going to read that again. What provokes the troubling exhortation of the poet of Psalm 44, wake up, is the awareness that history, that's what this psalm is about, not floods and hurricanes, but marauding armies and peoples. What provokes that troubling exhortation, I'm going to add to God, is the awareness that history, no less than nature, slips out of God's control. Really? If you have a doctrine of divine omnipotence, then the only way in which bad things can happen is if somehow God wanted it or didn't care. But if you have a notion of the drama of divine omnipotence, these are moments when God doesn't impose God's will. What provokes that troubling exhortation is the awareness that history, no less than nature, slips out of God's control and into the hands of obscure but potent forces of malignancy that oppose everything God is reputed to uphold. The jubilation that follows the announcement, this is Psalm 97, God reigns. Adonai malach. Melech is the noun, malach is the verb. The jubilation that follows the announcement, God is king, in the enthronement psalms, a certain genre of psalms, where God is announced on his throne again, in the spring, for example. The jubilation that follows the announcement, God is king, in those enthronement psalms, strongly commends the translation, God has become king. The reassertion of divine omnipotence, which is always possible. For it argues for the reality of the contrast between the grave situation before the announcement that God is king and the happy times that follows it. Right? Degradation, divine recession, receding, and God comes to the aid of people. We're going to next time read from the second Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, where that is precisely the use of creation by Isaiah, that God is going to do something new based upon his creation of the world out of nothing and redeem the people from Babylonia. So that's the use of creation over and against a particular historical crisis by a subsequent prophet. The worshiping community doesn't burst into song because they have suddenly recalled the uniform, uninterrupted truth that God is in control. Rather, their excitement is owing to the perception that he is at last about to redeem them as befits his faithfulness. God's faithfulness is one half of the covenantal relationship. And Levinson is going to try to show that creation needs to be understood in the context of covenant. When God promised to Noah he will not do certain things again, and creates the covenant. And here the covenant is bilateral. God has obligations, we have obligations. The possibility of an interruption in his faithfulness is indeed troubling. That's Levinson's confession. He doesn't know how to explain it. And I repeat, I'm reading him, I have ventured no explanation for it. I might add that I find it especially odd that scholars who lived through the years of the Holocaust and other unspeakable horrors of our century should have imagined that the Hebrew Bible consistently upheld the doctrine of God's uniform, uninterrupted kingship, in spite of ample evidence to the contrary. You see the point that he's making. In the horror of the Holocaust, how is it that scholars especially know the Bible and this notion of the drama of divine omnipotence, how could they maintain that God is omnipotent? That creates the problem. Why the heck didn't God come to our aid? And Levinson's answer, Levinson's view of the Bible's answer, is that there are times when God isn't expressing the possibility of his omnipotence as a way of understanding both why bad things happen and why we should continue to believe in this God. That the benefits of believing in this God outweigh the deficiencies, and therefore we need a theory to help us understand why I should maintain faith in God in desperate times. You see, I mean, this is a scholarly book, right? But he's really trying to explain a question we have and trying to not minimize the problems. Oh, evil is just the absence of good. That's one way of dealing with it. Evil is not itself a reality. It's just the absence of good. So what's the problem? No. Levinson is saying evil is real. Bad stuff is real. It's written on the face of nature and history. Well, if that's the case in God's good world, let's give up on God. No, we don't have to. If we have a theory of the drama of divine omnipotence. You see how powerful a view of creation this is, that it can yield this complexity, illustrated over and over again, as Psalm 44 does, in the Hebrew Bible. Levinson is making the claim that not only is this a brilliant theory, he didn't say that, but I am, but it's also biblical. Who knew? That's where modernity and its issues have unlocked something hitherto unseen in the Bible, I might say. I think we need to stop because something else is about to happen. I told you what it is. Stay for the discussion if you wish, but obviously you're welcome to leave. No Torah study next week, and the week after we'll come back again, continue the creation story, and then move on to our next topic sometime during this year, sibling rivalry. Okay, very good. Shabbat shalom. Where is?
Maybe God's on the other side.
The meeting is here, isn't it?
I know.
I acknowledge that, because that's the way it is. I don't care. I'm sorry for these people. But in general, chemistry is quite different. It's just that, and it's good.
No, but I think this was the best time for me because I was here. Yeah, but you'd be better.